Hello? Before you settle in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, only if you like what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to see who's joining us from around the world. July 15th, 1099. The ancient stones of Jerusalem, baked by the unforgiving sun of the Levant, are slick with a crimson tide. The city's streets, which have seen prophets and pilgrims, conquerors and kings, are now flowing with blood. Following a brutal month-long siege, soldiers from a distant land, their tunics emblazoned with the sign of the cross, have breached the walls of the holy city. The eyewitness accounts that survive this day speak of a slaughter so absolute, so complete, that the victors waded in blood up to their ankles and the bridles of their horses. The priest Raymond of Aguilar, chaplain to one of the Crusade's leaders, wrote with grim satisfaction, "Wonderful sights were to be seen. Some of our men cut off the heads of their enemies, others shot them with arrows so that they fell from the towers, others tortured them longer by casting them into the flames. In the temple and porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins." This was not just a battle, it was a reckoning, a convulsion of violence that would echo for 1,000 years. This was the terrifying, earth-shattering climax of what history would come to call the First Crusade, an event destined to redraw the maps of empires and carve a deep, lasting wound between two of the world's great religions, a wound that, in many ways, has never truly healed. The official story, the one repeated in chronicles and sung by troubadours in the flickering firelight of European castles, is deceptively simple. This was a righteous war, a holy pilgrimage under arms, undertaken to reclaim Christianity's most sacred site from the hands of unbelievers. This was the narrative that shaped the warrior ethos of an entire generation, celebrated in epic poems like the Chanson de Roland, where noble Christian knights fought valiantly against monolithic Saracen hordes. In that foundational text of chivalry, the hero Roland declares he would rather die 1,000 deaths than bring shame upon sweet France, fighting not just for his king, Charlemagne, but for God himself. The poem portrays the enemy as a vast, undifferentiated mass of idol-worshipping pagans, a simple backdrop for Christian heroism. This black-and-white worldview, where one's own side is sanctified and the enemy is utterly demonized, was the essential psychological fuel for the Crusades. It provided a moral certainty that could justify any action, no matter how brutal, in the service of a higher cause. But as any investigator knows, the official story is never, ever the whole story. The truth is far more complex, a tangled web of desperation, ambition, and pure, blind chance. The violent birth of the Crusader era was not a foregone conclusion, not a grand, unified plan conceived in the halls of power. It was an accident. It was a geopolitical perfect storm, a fire ignited by a chain reaction of fatal miscalculations that emanated from three entirely different corners of the medieval world. To truly understand how this global conflict erupted, we cannot simply read the histories. We must approach it like a crime scene. We have to sift through the evidence, follow the trail of whispers and pleas, and uncover the motivations of our key persons of interest. This isn't a simple case of heroes and villains, it's a tragedy of errors, a series of seemingly rational decisions that, when combined, produced a cataclysm. We must find out who, exactly, lit the fuse. Our investigation begins not in the blood-soaked streets of Jerusalem, but in the opulent yet terrified heart of a dying empire, Constantinople. Here we find our first person of interest, the Emperor Alexios Theos Komnenos. To understand his role, you must immediately discard the image of a holy warrior or a pious crusader king. Think of Alexios instead as the beleaguered CEO of a failing superpower, the man at the helm of a magnificent ship that was taking on water from all sides. The Byzantine Empire, the last glittering remnant of ancient Rome, was bleeding out. For centuries it had been the bulwark of Christendom in the East, a beacon of civilization and wealth, but by the late 11th century, its light was flickering dangerously. Constantinople, the Queen of Cities, was a marvel of the world, protected by the immense Theodosian walls that had repelled every attacker for 700 years. Within those walls stood architectural wonders like the Hagia Sophia, its colossal dome seeming to float on a cushion of light, and the Hippodrome, where chariot races still echoed the glory of old Rome. Its markets overflowed with silk, spices and gold from across the known world. To a visitor from the comparatively rustic West, it was a vision of almost divine power and sophistication, yet this magnificent facade concealed a deep and corrosive decay. The cause of this rapid decline can be pinpointed to a single, disastrous day, August 26, 1071. After the catastrophic defeat of the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where the Seljuk Turkish forces led by the brilliant Alp Arslan not only routed the imperial army, but captured the emperor himself, Romanos IV Diogenes, the empire began to hemorrhage territory at a terrifying rate. Manzikert wasn't just a military loss, it was a profound psychological trauma. The capture of an emperor was an unprecedented humiliation, shattering the myth of Byzantine invincibility and triggering a decade of brutal civil war as rival generals fought for the now vulnerable throne. The battle itself was a tactical nightmare, a result of Byzantine overconfidence and internal treachery. As Romanos IV advanced deep into enemy territory, one of his key commanders, Andronikos Doukas, a political rival, deliberately spread a rumour that the emperor had fallen and then withdrew his entire reserve force from the field at a critical moment. This betrayal left the main army exposed and encircled. Romanos, fighting bravely, was unhorsed and captured, forced to prostrate himself before Alp Arslan in a scene that would haunt the Byzantine imagination for generations. While he was soon released, his authority was irrevocably broken, and the empire descended into chaos. Anatolia, the vast peninsula of modern-day Turkey, was the empire's heartland, its primary source of grain, its main recruiting ground for soldiers, and it was now almost entirely lost. On the map of his domain, Alexios saw a sea of red where his richest provinces used to be. The Seljuks, a Turkic-Persian Sunni Muslim dynasty that had swept out of the eastern steppes, were not like previous enemies. They weren't just raiding for plunder, they were conquering, settling, and building a new power base, the Sultanate of Rum, right on Constantinople's doorstep with its capital established at Nicaea, a city so close that its towers were practically visible from the Great Gorod of Constantinople on a clear day. This was an existential threat, but it wasn't his only one. From the north, Pecheneg raiders, a fierce nomadic people from the Eurasian steppe, swarmed across the Danube, threatening the Balkan provinces. These were not organised armies, but lightning-fast horsemen who lived in the saddle, striking without warning to plunder villages and carry off slaves, melting back into the grasslands before the slow-moving imperial legions could respond. They had even besieged Constantinople itself in 1091, a terrifying moment when the city seemed on the verge of being starved into submission. From the west, ambitious Norman warlords from southern Italy, led by the cunning Robert Guiscard and his even more formidable son Bohemond, eyed his Balkan territories, dreaming of conquering Constantinople itself. These were the descendants of Vikings who had settled in France and then conquered southern Italy, a breed of relentless land-hungry warriors. Alexios knew their capabilities intimately. Early in his reign, at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, he had been soundly defeated by Guiscard's army. He had watched in horror as the Norman knights, in a coordinated, thunderous charge, had smashed his elite Varangian guard to pieces. This memory was seared into his mind. The imperial treasury was empty, the army was a shadow of its former self, and the empire was being attacked from every conceivable direction. Alexios, a brilliant general and a canny politician who had seized the throne amidst this chaos in 1081, was a master of survival. He had clawed his way to power through intrigue and force of arms, and he ruled with a pragmatist's cold calculation. He debased the imperial coinage to pay his troops, melted down church treasures, and played his enemies against one another with a masterful blend of diplomacy and deceit. He was running out of money, out of land, and most critically out of options. He needed soldiers, not just any soldiers, but elite, professional, merciless heavy cavalry, and he knew exactly where to find them, among the Franks of Western Europe. The Byzantines had a long and storied tradition of using foreign mercenaries, most famously the elite Varangian Guard, composed of axe-wielding Vikings and, after 1066, dispossessed Anglo-Saxon warriors. But Alexios needed something different. He had personally faced the Norman knights of southern Italy, and had seen firsthand the terrifying power of their disciplined lance-couch charge. It was a tactic that could shatter infantry formations and even put heavy cavalry to flight, a unique military technology that he believed could be the key to pushing the Seljuks back. This wasn't simply a matter of hiring more bodies, it was about acquiring a specific state-of-the-art weapon system that his own depleted armies could no longer field effectively. Put yourself in his shoes for a moment. You need to hire the best mercenaries the world has to offer, but your coffers are bare. What do? You don't make a simple business transaction. You make an offer someone can't refuse. You craft an appeal so compelling, so emotionally resonant, that it transcends mere politics and finance. You wrap a desperate business proposal in the sacred language of faith. In 1095, taking advantage of a church council being held in Piacenza, Italy, Alexios sent envoys to the most powerful man in Western Europe, Pope Urban II. He painted a grim, harrowing picture of Christian suffering in the East, Vostok, of churches desecrated and pilgrims brutalized by the advancing Turks. His envoys spoke of the plight of the Eastern Church and the danger to Constantinople, the second Rome itself. He appealed to their shared faith, begging for help from his Christian brothers to defend the faith against the infidel. But we must be absolutely clear about his intentions. Alexios was not asking for a holy war. He was not calling for a mass migration of the faithful to reconquer Jerusalem. He wanted a specific tool for a specific job, a small controllable contingent of elite Frankish knights, perhaps a few thousand strong, who would serve under his command as mercenaries. They would be paid, supplied, and directed by him. He expected them to swear an oath of fealty, promising to return any formerly Byzantine lands they captured back to his authority. He envisioned a manageable professional force that he could integrate into his own command structure, use to recapture Nicaea and secure the Anatolian coastline, and then send home with handsome payment. He wanted a scalpel to carefully carve the Seljuk tumour out of his backyard and restore Byzantine authority in Anatolia. What he got, through a series of epic misinterpretations and political amplifications, was a sledgehammer that would shatter the geopolitical landscape of the entire region. The desperate letter from Emperor Alexios, carried by his envoys, travelled from Constantinople across the sea and up the Italian peninsula, finally landing in the hands of our second key suspect, Pope Urban II. And if Alexios inadvertently struck the match, it was Urban who enthusiastically doused the flame with gasoline. When the Pope received the Emperor's plea for military aid, he didn't just see a crisis unfolding in a distant land. He saw something far greater. He saw a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to solve several of his own pressing problems and reshape the Western world in his image. The papacy of the late 11th century was in the midst of a titanic power struggle with the secular rulers of Europe, most notably the Holy Roman Emperor, in what is known as the investiture controversy, a fight over who had the ultimate authority to appoint church officials. To a modern ear, this might sound like a minor administrative squabble, but in an age where bishops and abbots were also powerful feudal lords who controlled vast lands and armies, the power to appoint them was the power to control kingdoms. A king who could install his loyal cronies as bishops was a king with immense power. A pope who could appoint his own men could challenge that king's authority on his own soil. It was a fundamental battle for the soul of Europe. Would it be ruled by a divinely ordained emperor, or by God's vicar on earth, the Pope? Urban's predecessor, the fiery Gregory VII, had gone head-to-head with Emperor Henry IV, excommunicating him and forcing him to perform a humiliating public penance at Canossa. In a masterful piece of political theatre, the emperor stood for 3 days in the snow outside the castle of Canossa, barefoot and dressed as a penitent, begging the Pope for forgiveness. But Henry had ultimately triumphed, marching on Rome and forcing Gregory into exile. Urban, a reformer and a brilliant political strategist, had inherited this struggle. He was looking for a way to assert the supremacy of the papacy, to show kings and emperors that it was the Pope in Rome who was the true leader of Christendom. Launching a major international war under the banner of the Church, an army that no king could command, would be the ultimate demonstration of papal authority. It would be a project so grand, so holy, that it would transcend the petty squabbles of kings and emperors, uniting all of Christendom under a single papal-led initiative. Furthermore, 11th century Europe had a severe violence problem. A demographic and economic boom, fueled by better farming techniques and a warming climate, had led to a surplus population, including a whole warrior class of armoured, land-hungry knights. With the system of primogeniture leaving younger sons with no inheritance, these men had little to do but fight each other in endless, destructive private wars over scraps of land. These weren't chivalrous tournaments. They were brutal conflicts that devastated the countryside, targeting peasants, burning crops, and destroying monasteries. The Church had spent decades trying to contain this chaos through the Peace and Truce of God movements, which used the threat of excommunication to forbid violence against non-combatants and prohibit fighting on holy days. These movements were only partially successful. They were like placing a bandage on a gaping wound. The fundamental problem remained. A society geared for war had no great war to fight. Urban needed a project, a grand enterprise that could channel this destructive energy outward, exporting the violence that was tearing France and Germany apart. A war in the distant Vostok was the perfect solution. It would unite Europe's warring nobles under a single banner, his banner. It would give them a holy purpose, a chance to use their martial skills not for sinful personal gain, but for the glory of God. It would assert the Pope's authority over kings by mobilizing an army that no monarch could command. And, as a tantalizing side benefit, it might even offer a chance to heal the Great Schism of 1054, the bitter theological split that had separated his Western Catholic Church from Alexios's Eastern Orthodox Church for over 40 years. The schism, rooted in disputes over papal authority and theological details like the Filioque clause in the Nicene Creed, was a deep wound in the body of Christ. The Filioque, Latin for "and the Son," was a phrase the Western Church had added to the Creed, stating that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. The Eastern Church rejected this, seeing it as an unauthorized alteration of sacred doctrine and a demotion of the Father's primary role within the Trinity. While seemingly obscure, this and other differences in ritual language, Latin versus Greek, and custom had been magnified by centuries of growing political and cultural divergence. By coming to the aid of Constantinople, Urban could present himself as the benevolent leader of all Christians, East and West, potentially paving the way for a reunion of the churches, under his authority, of course. So, in a frost-covered field in Clermont, France, in November 1095, Pope Urban II delivered what would become one of the most effective and consequential speeches in human history. He took Alexios's pragmatic professional request for mercenaries and masterfully transformed it into a passionate, emotional and spiritual call to arms for all of Christendom. Speaking to a massive crowd of clergy, nobles and common folk, he amplified the stories of suffering pilgrims and desecrated holy sites. Drawing on reports from the East, some true, some exaggerated, he painted a lurid picture of the atrocities committed by the Turks against fellow Christian. He spoke of Christians being forcibly circumcised, of their blood being used to defile altars, of churches being turned into stables. He was not just requesting aid for a fellow ruler, he was framing this as a defensive war to save all of Christendom from an existential threat. He spoke of the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Christ himself, being in the hands of the enemies of God. Then he made an offer that no king or emperor could ever match. He offered a spiritual get-out-of-jail-free card, the full remission of all sins, a plenary indulgence for anyone who took up the cross and journeyed to liberate Jerusalem. For a deeply pious and sin-fearing society, where the threat of eternal damnation in the fires of hell was a terrifyingly real and everyday concern, this was an offer of unimaginable power. For a violent knight, whose entire life was a catalogue of sins, it offered a path to purification without having to abandon his profession. For a landless peasant, it offered escape from a life of grinding poverty and servitude. It promised salvation, adventure, and the chance for land and wealth all rolled into one. It was a political masterstroke wrapped in a prayer, a perfect fusion of worldly ambition and genuine piety. As he finished, a low murmur rippled through the enormous crowd. Then, a single cry rose from the assembled thousands, led by Bishop Adhéma of Le Puy, who would become Urban's chosen representative on the expedition. Then another, and another, until the entire field was shaking with a singular deafening chant, Deus vult! Deus vult! God wills it! God wills it! The sound spread like a shockwave, a point of no return. Priests began distributing strips of cloth for the faithful to sew onto their garments in the shape of a cross, the symbol of their vow. The response was far greater, far more immediate, and far more popular than Urban himself could have ever anticipated. He had tapped into a deep reservoir of piety, aggression, and anxiety that was simmering just beneath the surface of European society. The call had been answered, but the force that Urban had just unleashed was a raw, unpredictable power, a human flood that no one, not even the Pope himself, could possibly hope to control. And it was now aimed directly at a power in the East that was far from the unified, monolithic threat that the West imagined. The final, crucial piece of our puzzle, the third volatile ingredient in this explosive mixture, lies not in the courts of Constantinople or Rome, but in the fractured political landscape of the Middle East itself. The zealous preachers and fervent knights gathering in Europe were operating under a profound illusion. They believed they were marching against a single monolithic Islamic empire, a unified caliphate that stood as a formidable barrier between them and their goal. They were profoundly, disastrously wrong. In reality, they were not marching into a fortress. They were marching straight into the middle of a bitter and chaotic civil war. To understand this, we need to talk about betrayal and power vacuums, not a dry list of dynasties. For years, the vast Seljuk Sultanate had been the dominant power in the region, held together by the political and military genius of two men, the powerful Sultan Malik Shah Tharwin and his brilliant Persian vizier, Nizam al-Mulk. Together, they had consolidated an empire that stretched from Anatolia to Central Asia. This was a golden age of stability and cultural flourishing. They patronized arts and sciences, supporting figures like the great poet and astronomer Omar Khayyam. Nizam al-Mulk established a network of universities, or madrasas, across the empire, and his treatise on statecraft, the Siyasatnama, is a masterpiece of political science. These madrasas standardized Sunni Islamic law and theology, creating a unified intellectual culture that bound the disparate parts of the empire together. Under their rule, the Seljuk Empire was a sophisticated, well-administered and militarily potent state. But in the year 1092, just 3 short years before Pope Urban's call to crusade echoed across France, this stable power structure catastrophically imploded. First, the vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, was assassinated by a member of the shadowy Ismaili sect known as the Order of Assassins. Led by the enigmatic Hassani Sabah from his mountain fortress of al-Mulk, the assassins waged a campaign of targeted political murder against the Sunni Seljuk leadership, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and terror. They were a radical offshoot of Ismaili Shia Islam who believed the Seljuk rulers were illegitimate usurpers of the caliphate. Their agents, known as fidai, those who sacrificed themselves, would infiltrate the courts and military commands of their enemies, often spending months or years gaining trust before striking down their target in public, usually with a dagger. Their goal was not to conquer territory, but to destabilize the Sunni establishment through psychological warfare, and in the murder of Nizam al-Mulk, they achieved a spectacular success. Just weeks later, the Sultan himself, Malik Shah, died under mysterious circumstances, most likely from poison administered by rivals within his own court. With the 2 central pillars of the empire suddenly gone, the entire edifice shattered almost overnight. The empire was instantly plunged into a vicious succession crisis. Malik Shah's sons, brothers, and ambitious regional governors, known as atabegs, immediately turned on one another, fighting for control of the fragments. In Persia, his sons Barkiyaruk and Muhammad Vantapar fought a ruinous 5-year war. In Syria, his brother Tutush I carved out his own kingdom before he was killed, leaving his own sons, Ridwan of Aleppo and Dukak of Damascus, to wage their own bitter and fratricidal war against each other. The Seljuk world devolved into a mosaic of smaller warring states and petty emirates. While the Christian West was, for the first time in centuries, uniting under a single, albeit spiritual banner, the Islamic East was tearing itself apart with unprecedented ferocity. The situation was further complicated by another major power player, the Fatimid Caliphate based in Egypt. The Fatimids were Shia Muslims and regarded the Sunni Seljuks and the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, for whom the Seljuks were the de facto protectors, as illegitimate usurpers. For decades, the Fatimids and Seljuks had been locked in a cold war for influence and control over Syria and Palestine. In fact, just a year before the Crusaders arrived in 1098, the Fatimids saw the Seljuk civil war as an opportunity and seized control of Jerusalem from its Seljuk governor. When the Fatimids first heard rumours of the approaching Frankish army, their initial reaction was not one of alarm but of cautious optimism. They assumed these newcomers were little more than Byzantine mercenaries, perhaps sent by their mutual enemy, the Seljuks, and might even prove to be useful, if temporary allies. They even sent envoys to the Crusader camp proposing an alliance. The Franks could have Syria, while the Fatimids would keep Palestine and Jerusalem. They fundamentally misunderstood the religious motivation and the ultimate goal of the expedition. The local emirs ruling cities like Antioch, Aleppo, and Damascus were far more concerned with their immediate rivals next door than with some strange barbarian army rumoured to be gathering in a distant land they had barely even heard of. Far from presenting a united front, they were actively plotting against each other, sometimes even seeking temporary opportunistic alliances with the very Christian invaders they were supposed to be fighting. The Crusaders were not, as they imagined, walking into a lion's den. They were walking into a bar fight that was already in full swing, and no one was paying them much attention until it was far too late. A desperate emperor's calculated gamble for mercenaries, an ambitious pope's world-changing sermon, a fractured, self-destructing enemy completely unprepared for the storm about to break over its head. The three volatile powders were now in place side by side. The world was about to explode. The explosion came in two distinct waves. The first force to answer the Pope's call was not an army in any recognizable sense. It was a chaotic, disorganized mob. History calls it the People's Crusade, a tragic and volatile mixture of peasants, urban poor, low-level knights, religious zealots, and outright fanatics, all swept up in the fervour of the moment. Fueled by years of famine, plague, and a widespread belief that the end of days was near, tens of thousands sold their belongings, abandoned their homes, and set off for the east with little more than faith to sustain them. Led by charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit, a diminutive but fiery orator who rode through the countryside on a donkey, and a poor knight named Walter Sans-Avoir, Walter the Penniless, these massive crowds set off for the east with far more faith than sense, supplies, or military discipline. Their journey was a disaster from the start. As they marched through the Rhineland, some contingents, inflamed by rhetoric that targeted all enemies of Christ, turned their fury on the ancient Jewish communities of cities like Mainz and Cologne. These communities were among the oldest and most prosperous in Europe. Crusaders, led by figures like Count Emico of Flonheim, argued that it was illogical to march thousands of miles to fight God's enemies abroad while leaving the killers of Christ unpunished in their own lands. Arguing that they should deal with the infidels at home before marching thousands of miles to fight those abroad, they perpetrated horrific massacres in the first large-scale popular anti-Semitic pogroms of the medieval era, offering their victims the choice of conversion or death. Thousands were slaughtered, often after local bishops had tried and failed to offer them protection. This dark overture demonstrated the terrifying, unpredictable nature of the popular zeal Urban had unleashed. As the peasant armies continued east, they plundered their way across Hungary and the Balkans, alienating the local Christian populations and fighting pitched battles with Byzantine garrisons sent to shadow them. By the time the survivors of this chaotic pilgrimage reached Constantinople, Emperor Alexios was horrified. This was not the elite fighting force he had requested. This was a starving, unruly, and uncontrollable rabble that was pillaging his suburbs. He quickly ferried the unruly mob across the Bosporus into Asia Minor, hoping they might at least serve as a distraction for the Seljuks. They did not last long. Ignoring advice to wait for the main princely armies, the undisciplined host advanced into Seljuk territory. Near Nicaea, the forces of the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan, who had initially dismissed them as another disorganized rabble of Byzantine mercenaries, cornered and annihilated them. It was a massacre. Their crusade was an outpouring of passion without power, and it ended in blood and failure. But then, after the mob, came the real army. This was the Prince's Crusade, the sledgehammer Alexios had never wanted. This force was composed of 4 main contingents led by some of the most powerful nobles in Western Europe: Godfrey of Bouillon and his brother Baldwin of Boulogne from Lorraine, devout men of high standing, the formidable Norman Prince Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred from southern Italy, who were land-hungry adventurers and old enemies of Alexios, Raymond IV of Toulouse, the oldest, wealthiest, and most powerful of the leaders, from southern France, who saw himself as the natural, secular head of the expedition, and the forces from northern France led by Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy and luckless son of William the Conqueror. These were professional, battle-hardened, brutal and single-minded warriors. Their arrival in Constantinople created a new crisis for Alexios, who cajoled and threatened them into swearing oaths of fealty before shipping them across the Bosporus. He used a mixture of lavish gifts and subtle military threats, positioning his own troops menacingly nearby to extract their promises to return former Byzantine territory. The Crusaders, for their part, were deeply suspicious of the sophisticated and, to their minds, effeminate and untrustworthy Greeks. They successfully besieged and captured the Seljuk capital of Nicaea, which they were forced to hand over to the Byzantines to their great annoyance, won a crucial victory against Kilij Arslan at Dorylaeum after nearly being defeated, and then endured a horrific year-long march across the arid plains of Anatolia. This march tested them to their absolute limits, with thousands dying of thirst, starvation and heatstroke. The landscape was desolate, stripped of supplies by the retreating Turks. Horses died by the hundreds, forcing knights to walk or ride on oxen. Water was so scarce that men would reportedly drink their own urine or the blood of their animals. It was during this march that personal ambition first fractured the Crusades' unity, when Baldwin of Boulogne left the main army and ventured east to the city of Edessa, where he manoeuvred his way into becoming its ruler, establishing the first of the Crusader states. Their greatest test came at the massive city of Antioch, where a grueling 8-month siege reduced them to starvation, disease, and even, according to some horrifying accounts, cannibalism. The city's defences were formidable, and the Crusader army was too small to fully encircle it. The siege dragged on through a miserable winter, and morale plummeted. The chronicler Radulf of Caen wrote grimly of the starving soldiers. In Antioch they cooked the flesh of adult Musulman in pots, and they fixed the bodies of their children on spits and ate them grilled. Yet, through a combination of treachery, from within the city, an Armenian guard named Firuz was bribed by Bohemond, and their own grim determination, they took Antioch, only to be immediately besieged themselves by a massive Muslim relief army from Mosul, led by the Atabeg Kaboga. Trapped within the city they had just captured, with their food supplies exhausted, the Crusaders were now in an even more desperate position than before. Many deserted, including the expedition's spiritual leader Adhemar of Le Puy, who died of disease. At this moment of absolute despair, something extraordinary happened. On the brink of annihilation, their morale was miraculously restored by the supposed discovery of the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side on the cross, unearthed by a visionary peasant named Peter Bartholomew. While its authenticity was fiercely debated, Bohemond and his Normans were openly sceptical, the discovery electrified the common soldiers. Believing they now possessed a holy relic that guaranteed divine favour, their fear was replaced by a fanatical courage. In a desperate charge, they sallied forth and routed the larger, overconfident and disunited Muslim force. After bitter infighting over who would rule their new prize, with Bohemond ultimately claiming Antioch for himself in direct violation of his oath to Alexios, they finally marched on to their ultimate goal, the holy city of Jerusalem. They had carved a bloody path through the fractured Seljuk lands, a journey that culminated in the horrific sack of Jerusalem we witnessed at the very beginning. They had, against all odds, won. But what was the true cost of this victory? The consequences of their success were a cascade of unintended ironies. Emperor Alexios never regained full control of Anatolia. He had simply traded a familiar enemy for a new, powerful and utterly unpredictable neighbour in the form of the Crusader states. The dream of Christian unity, which had so motivated Pope Urban, was shattered. The Crusaders' relationship with their Byzantine allies was permanently poisoned by suspicion and betrayal. a hostility that would culminate a century later in the yet disgraceful sack of Christian Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade. And the original stated goal of securing peaceful pilgrimage to the holy sites was replaced by 2 centuries of near-constant brutal warfare. The shock of the Frankish conquest and the fall of Jerusalem would, over decades, begin to catalyse a Muslim counter-reaction. A previously little-used concept of defensive jihad began to be preached by a few far-sighted scholars, like the Damascus-based Alim Ali ibn Tahir al-Sulami, who called for Muslim unity against the invaders. In his book, Kitab al-Jihad, the Book of Jihad, written in 1105, he lamented the disunity and selfishness of the Muslim princes and argued that their defeats were a divine punishment for their sins. He was one of the first to correctly identify the Crusaders' religious motivation and to call for an equivalent spiritual and military response. For the moment few listened, but the seeds of reconquest had been sown, and here we come to the final bitter irony of this entire enterprise, a fact that lays bare the complex web of motivations at play. Do you know who became the biggest and most reliable business partners of the Muslim emirs in the newly conquered territories during the height of the Crusades? The very same Venetian and Genoese merchants who were being paid vast sums of money by the church and European nobles to transport the Crusader armies to the Holy Land. In a stunning display of pragmatic capitalism, their ships would ferry soldiers of the cross eastward on one voyage, and on the return journey, their holds would be filled with the silks, spices, and other valuable goods purchased from the very infidels those soldiers had just been fighting. The Italian city-states secured lucrative trade concessions in the ports captured by the Crusaders, establishing their own quarters in cities like Acre and Tyre. They created a vast commercial network that connected Europe with the markets of the Middle East, a network that operated with a logic entirely separate from the holy war raging around it. The official purpose of the expedition was the glory of Christa. At Naco for the Italian maritime republics, the goals were far more worldly. They were Tolka interested in one thing: profit. Their involvement serves as the ultimate proof that even in the midst of the most fervent holy war, business is, and always will be, business. The First Crusade was never a simple story of good versus evil, of a righteous West against a wicked East. It was a far more human story, a story of unintended consequences, where the desperation of a dying empire, the soaring ambition of a political pope, and the chaotic division of their target collided to create a legacy of conflict, misunderstanding, and violence that we are still grappling with today. It stands as a powerful and chilling reminder that some of the most world-changing, epoch-defining events in human history often begin not with a grand unified plan, but with a series of distinct, unrelated, and ultimately fatal miscalculations. Alexios miscalculated the religious fervour and martial ambition of the West. Urban miscalculated his ability to control the violent, popular energies he had unleashed. And the emirs of the East fatally miscalculated the nature and scale of the threat marching toward them until it was too late. The world post 1099 was irrevocably different, setting in motion a cycle of crusade and jihad that would dominate relations between these cultures for generations. The institutions created by the Crusade, such as the military orders of the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, would become immensely powerful international corporations in their own right, combining piety with military prowess and finance. And the very idea of a crusade would enter the European consciousness as a tool that could be wielded not just against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against pagans in the Baltic, heretics in France, and the political enemies of the Pope in Italy. The saga, of course, does not end here in the blood-stained streets of Jerusalem, or Rusali as it was known to pilgrims arriving from the Slavic East. This was just the beginning. This was only the First Crusade. The chaos, the fervour, and the violence would continue for centuries, spiralling into ever more complex and bizarre campaigns, including the strange and utterly tragic episode known as the Children's Crusade. Was this truly a spontaneous, innocent act of pure faith by thousands of children hoping to succeed where armies had failed? Or was it something far darker? A cynical human trafficking scheme orchestrated by merchants who saw an opportunity to profit from the piety of the desperate? Was it a mass popular delusion, a protest by the poor against the failures of the rich and powerful knights who had lost Jerusalem? That is a compelling and disturbing investigation for another day. If you want to see us uncover the truth behind that story, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. And I want to hear your verdict. Let me know in the comments which of our three suspects, the desperate emperor, the ambitious pope, or the broken Seljuk Empire, do you think was most responsible for igniting this accidental holy war? Until next time, keep questioning the official story. If you enjoyed this video, please support the channel, like, share, and subscribe. Please leave a comment telling us what you think of this video.